There needs to be enough water. You got to be able to get the water out of the ground, and it's got to be usable water. Those three things.
The Ready Life. Into the country.
Hi, I'm Lisa Meisner.
And I'm Nick, her husband.
Welcome back to the Ready Life podcast, where you'll learn how to become more independent for the basic necessities of life, like water, heat, food, and the power that so many of us have come to depend on. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about how to evaluate a water well. If you're looking at property or you're looking at, a new home or homestead, then...
Or even your existing well.
Yeah, that's true. Or even your existing well. Water is something, it's one of the basic necessities. You cannot live without it. And so many times we've heard people that are super excited about getting their home or their property, and they buy it, and then they move in and realize a little too late that the water situation is not very conducive.
It's kind of an afterthought.
Yeah, it is. It is
just a natural assumption we make that if there's a house there, there's got to be a good water system.
Yeah.
Or if you buy that property, naturally there's water under the ground, but that's not always the case.
Yes.
Sadly.
Yeah. So you want to do due diligence, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this episode. And even when doing due diligence, sometimes there's some tricks to look out for. But the bottom line, it really isn't all that complicated. There's three things that you need to have a good water system. Mm-hmm. There needs to be enough water. You got to be able to get the water out of the ground, and it's got to be usable water. Those three things, and that's pretty simple. We're going to dig in to each of these, but at the end of the day, that's what you need is enough water, got to be able to get it out of the ground, and it's got to be usable water. Mm-hmm. That's right. So enough water, that really is going to depend upon your lifestyle, right?
How much water you need.
Yeah, exactly. But I think there's like a gold standard that you want at least 5 gallons a minute in your well.
That's what's specified by many lending agencies or financial institutions when they're lending money on mortgages and things like this. What the number that I hear most often is that they require the well to be producing at least 5 gallons per minute. So that's kind of your minimum. But, like you said, if you are planning on doing a ton of irrigation of a large field or something
or
like
an orchard or something
then
like that,
you're going to need more than that probably. And,
yes.
If you're doing nothing outside, if all you're needing is for domestic use, then you might not even need that. But that's just kind of a gold standard. You can make it work with less. So if you're already in that situation where you already have a well that's producing less than 5 gallons per minute, there are things that you can do to make it work. And we discussed this way back in episode number 13. So if you go to thereadylife.com/13, the number is 13, that'll get you to episode 13, where we discuss how to make a low-performing well work. And some helpful tips there. But please, if you're in the looking stage where you're actually looking for a property or for a new home, please do yourself a big favor, and if at all possible, hold out for plenty of water, because it's just everything is much better when you have an abundance of water. And when you've got too little water, it can affect so much of your life, especially when you're trying to live a more agrarian lifestyle, because that just requires water, for animals, for crops, for all these things. It requires water. And when you're looking at a homestead, there are some things that you can change, like the size of the house, for example.
But you can't change how much water is coming out of the ground. So
you can even haul in topsoil or something like that and make raised beds. Even if it's solid rock, you can build raised beds on top of solid rock if you had to. Not an ideal situation, certainly, but there are certain things that you can modify, like you're saying. But water,
you can't.
you have it or you don't. And so, hold out for, if at all possible, hold out for enough water. So how do you find out how much water that well is producing? Well, the well log is the quickest and easiest way to get an idea of this. But I have to warn you that a well log is not always perfectly accurate. Even the day that well was drilled, it's not something that was precision measured. A lot of times when a well driller's drilling the well and they're blowing water out, they're giving you an educated guess as to how much water it's producing. So just realize that at best, it's an educated guess. But as time goes on, the further you get from when that well was drilled, things can change over time.
I remember we had one friend who had a decent performing well, but then they had a neighbor that purchased land next door, and they drilled a well. And then all of a sudden their, decent performing well went way down, and all of a sudden they didn't have enough water. So, things like that can...
And they went and visited the neighbor, and come to find out the neighbor was running, I think, 7 impact sprinklers 24 hours a day.
Oh,
and they're pulling the water table down and using up a lot of the water in that aquifer. And so this is a concept that's really helpful to understand, that water often does not run in these little veins of water. That's a concept that has been promoted, I guess, by well witchers or I don't know what. But anyway, it's a very common misconception. Yes, there are instances where that happens, but most of the time, underground water is in aquifers. Some of them are very small, some of them are very large. And so it's very, very possible for you to be pulling water from the same aquifer as a neighbor. And when I say an aquifer, I'm not necessarily talking about it's not an underground lake.
Cavern,
we're just talking about a layer where it's often a sandy layer, sand or gravel layer underground, where there's an impermeable, either rock or clay underneath, that's stopping the water from going any further, and the water collects in this layer, and that's an aquifer. And so it's very possible for you and neighbors to be pulling from the same aquifer. So you are very likely to be affecting each other. Just depends upon the lay of the land and how big the aquifer is and things like that. But yeah, it can change over time is the moral of this story. So a well log can give you a rough idea if it's a really, really good well or a very poor well, mediocre well, these kinds of things when it was drilled, but just realize that things can change over time. So the best way to find your well log is there isn't one standard way. That all of the different states have different ways. Some states it's very difficult, some states it's super easy. And so after struggling through this for years, I finally said, okay, enough is enough. And I spent a bunch of time researching every state to find out how you can find the well log. And I put together this whole list and compiled it into a document for you about how to find a well log in all 50 states. And we're giving it away for listening to this podcast. It's our gift to you. You just go to thereadylifecom/find log, FINDLOG, no space, just thereadylifecom/FINDLOG, find log, and you can download that document, how to find your well log in all 50 states, and I think you'll find that super helpful. Like I said, there are some states where it's extremely difficult, but hopefully you're in one of the states where it's easy, and you can find out about it there. So that's your well log, but like we said, it's not always the most accurate. So a pump test is the most accurate way to tell what the yield of the well is. And if you're buying a place, I would highly recommend that you insist on a pump test if there's any question about the well. If when it was drilled, it was 100 gallons a minute and, you can run it and run it and run it and they've never run out of water, then maybe that's not as necessary. But if there's any question marks, it would be very wise to get a pump test, a professional pump test where they actually are measuring how much yield the well is actually able to produce by pumping it out with a pump under real conditions like that. That's the most accurate. A substitute for kind of a easier, quicker, lower cost substitute that isn't as accurate but can tell you what you need to know kind of is what I call a modified pump test. And that's basically if you were to, obviously the owner would have to agree, or if you already own the place, then you can do this. But basically you're going to open every outdoor spigot you can get your hands on. If it's near the house, put a hose on it, run it away from the house and away from the bleeder lines. You don't want to be doing this with any of your inside appliances that are going to run into the bleeder lines or you'll flood them. But you're going to open every outdoor faucet you can and run that pump as hard as you can. The pump that's in the well, you want to run it as hard as you can for 24 hours and see what happens. If after 24 hours, if you've got, 5 different spigots open outside where it's letting that pump run full blast as hard as it can, and if after 24 hours of that, the well has not run dry, then you know what you need to know, because what you're looking for is, can the well keep up with your pump? I really don't care if it's 100 gallons per minute or 10 gallons a minute. If the well can keep up with your pump, if the well never runs dry, if the pump can never pump the well dry, then you effectively have unlimited water. That's really what we're looking for. Is it possible for the pump to pump the well dry? And if not, then you're good. That's what you need to know. So that would be the quick and easy way of learning what you need to know about the production of the well. And the reason I say for 24 hours is because it is possible for a well to hit a underground reservoir of sorts where, and I actually have friends that this happened to them, where when the driller was drilling, he drilled the well, and unbeknownst to him, he hit a reservoir where there was a large underground reservoir of water. And so when he ran his test blowing water out of the well, it seemed like they had tons of water. So he put down, I think, 30 gallons a minute or something like that. But come to find out, the reservoir was, I think they figured maybe 1,000 or 2,000 gallons that it would hold about that much water. And if you were doing heavy irrigation and you actually pumped the well enough where you emptied that reservoir out, it come to find out the well was only producing about 1 gallon a minute. They found out the hard way. So that's why I say run it for 24 hours so that you can, avoid running into that kind of a situation.
Yeah.
So that is our first thing that we're looking for, making sure there's enough water. What's our second thing that we're looking for?
Well, you want to make sure that you can get it out of the ground.
That's right.
That's right. Really important, because if you've got a well and you got plenty of water, but you can't get it out of the ground, it does you no good.
That's right.
So
unless you have an artesian well, there's really only 2 ways to get the water out of the well without depending upon the grid for long-term use. So and this is one of the things that we're into is, yes, you could get a generator, a backup generator, and some gallons of gas and hook it up to your well, and you could run the pump during a blackout. But what we're really into is living a lifestyle where you could live long-term, where you're not just planning for a short-term emergency, but where you are as independent as possible for long-term use. And if you're depending upon your generator, then what happens if your generator breaks, if you run out of gas, if the gas goes bad, the carburetor plugs up, all kinds of things can happen.
All of a sudden you're without water.
You have nothing. Yeah. And if you are totally dependent upon that generator, your water's gone. What are you going to do? So yes. 2 ways for long-term ability to get water out of that well without depending on the grid. One option is to use an electric pump and power that pump with a off-grid power system that is sustainable, where it can sustainably produce its own power from, renewable sources like solar, hydro, whatever. That's one option. And option number 2 is a hand pump or similar mechanical device that can manually get water out of the well with human power. Those are the 2 ways, really, that you can ensure that your family has a sustainable source of water without depending upon the grid. Power your pump, power an electric pump with an off-grid power system, or a hand pump or other mechanical device.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. That's how we get the water out of the ground. The quickest, easiest way is to just put a hand pump on the well, leave everything else as is, and be done with it. And that's what most people do that are looking to make an improvement on their water situation. And it's great. It works. But just realize that during times when you don't have power, you're going to have to pump your water by hand. So if you're good with that, then at least you can get the water out of the ground. That's the key.
And, I just want to interject real quick. Putting in an off-grid power system is a fantastic idea. I mean, that's what we do. But, as with anything man-made, things can break down. And even with an off-grid power system, it's still wise to have redundancy built in, because especially for something so critical as water, if we were just talking about, one thing or another that's more convenience, it's okay, I could live without it, even though it's inconvenient, like lights, for example. You can live without lights. It's going to be very inconvenient, but you can do it. You can't live without water.
Right.
And so when it comes to water, make sure that you've got redundancy. Personally, I think every single well should have a hand pump on it. Off-grid, not off-grid, just put a hand pump on there, because you have to have access to water no matter what.
Yep.
So
Totally
anyway,
agree.
That's just my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, I totally agree. You got to have a non-electric mechanical way of getting water out of that well. And then beyond that, like you said, if you want to go beyond that, set up an off-grid power system where you could then have running water without having to pump with the hand pump, then that's great. And we love off-grid power systems, but you don't have to go that far. If you want a quick and easy first step, put a hand pump on your well, and at least you've got something to start with. And in many scenarios, it's possible to set up that hand pump where it could even pressurize your pressure tank in your house, where you go out and pump for 10 minutes or whatever, and then you've got a pressure tank full of water that you can live normally now.
Yep.
It depends upon the situation. When it's wintertime outside, you might not be able to do that. Just a lot of variables there, but I'm just throwing that out, that there's options like this that may be a possibility for you. So, so as far as, since we're on this topic of being able to get water out of the ground, we're looking at how do you evaluate a well. So we've looked at the 2 possibilities. When we're looking at a hand pump, what is it? What are the things that we need to know about that well to know that we could put a hand pump on there? Well, first off, the static water level is the most important factor. And static water level is how far from the surface is the water. We're not talking about the overall depth of the well. We're talking about how far down to the water. The well could be 300 feet deep. The water might only be 100 feet from the surface. That's what we're looking for. Static water level. Hand pumps can handle, there is at least one hand pump that can handle a static water level all the way down to 325 feet. Now, that's not ideal. Shallower is much better. The shallower your static water level is, the easier it's going to be to pump, the more water you'll get per stroke, and the more options you have, the more options as far as hand pumps out there that you'll have. But it is possible to go all the way down to 325 feet with one particular pump. That would be the Simple pump. Some of the good brands out there, Simple Pump, the Bison pump, Baker Monitor, that's the old cast iron type that you see in some state parks and things like that. Those are 3 of the best ones, the highest quality, heaviest duty ones out there. There's other options too. There's some cheaper ones as well that are more for just emergency use. But yeah, there's good options there. So that gives you an idea. You're looking on the well log once again for the static water level, and that can change also, just like the yield of the well. Static water level can change, and so if your well was drilled a while back, 20 years ago or 30 years ago or something like that, then it probably would not hurt to check the static water level yourself. You can do that by very carefully tying something small on the end of a string and very carefully dropping it down until you hear it go kerplunk. Just be aware, be very, very careful to not get it hung up in the electrical wires and pipe and stuff like that that's going down. That's the main hazard of that sort of thing. But it can definitely be done. And then what the static water level is. Just make sure that the pump is not running and hasn't been running for a little while, so that the water has had a chance to catch up, so that you know what the true static water level is. So static water level, and then another factor is the size of the casing, because hand pumps have to be able to fit along with the electric pump. That's the beauty of the hand pumps. If you're putting the hand pump in a well all by itself, then it practically doesn't matter. They can fit in almost any of those. But if you're putting it alongside an electric pump, it's ideal if the casing is 6-inch all the way down to the depth at which the hand pump is going to be placed. The cylinder will be placed. But even if it's less than that, it can often be handled. You'll just have to talk with the manufacturer. They'll have a form for you to fill out, and then they can tell you which of their pumps, and they've got all kinds of different options that they can come up with to make it work. But just be aware that the static water level and the size of the casing are a major factor here. And once again, as far as the static water level, you can find out about that on the well log by going to thereadylifecom/find log, FINDLOG, and figure out how to find your well log there. Or, like I just described, you can test it for yourself. And one other thing I wanted to mention before we leave this topic is that there is another type. What we've been talking about is a deep well hand pump. But there is another type of hand pump out there. It's often referred to as a shallow well hand pump, or a suction or siphon hand pump, or something along those lines. Sometimes they're called pitcher pumps. Basically, they operate on the principle of suction. A deep well hand pump actually puts the pumping mechanism down in the water and pushes the water up, because you can push water a long ways. But if you're suctioning, just picture yourself with a long straw trying to suck water up. You can only suck it so far. So suction only works for a limited distance, even with the best pumps out there. And so if you use a suction pump, the static water level has to be very shallow. And so with the very best suction or shallow well hand pumps out there, they can deal with a static water level down to 25 feet. And I'm talking 25 feet from the water level to the pump itself, not necessarily the ground. So if you've got 20 feet to the ground level and then another 10 feet up to where you're going to be putting the pump, that would not work. It's got to be no more than 25 feet from the water to the pump. And the other thing is, for every 1,000 feet in elevation that you go up, you got to subtract 1 foot. So if you're at 3,000 feet, then it would actually be 22 feet that it's able to deal with. But those are a really nice option because they can be less expensive. Deep well hand pumps can be a little spendy. Shallow well hand pumps are cheaper. They're easier installation often. And you don't have to pull the electric pump out or anything. Of course, you don't have to pull the electric pump with most deep well installations. But there, you can run into some complications with deep well pump installations. And we'll probably do an episode just on hand pumps where we'll get into all this in more depth at a later date. Yes. But for now, just realize that shallow well hand pumps are a nice option if you have a shallower static water level. And so that's why I say shallower static water level gives you more options. And it's a nice thing if you have that. And we have a upcoming course in the Ready Life Academy that's going to be all about hand pumps and go into all these details and walk you through it. And
our goal in that course is by the end, you'll be set up and ready to install your hand pump. So.
That's right. And it's also, like we mentioned, possible to use an electric pump that's powered with an off-grid power system. We discussed that in episode number 9. So if you go to thereadylife.com/9, the number 9, then you can listen to some options there about how to set up a water system with your well that is powered off the grid.
Which, by the way, when we talk about the basic necessities of life, we mention water, heat, and food, and often we'll mention power. It's not technically a basic necessity of life, but in a situation like this, where if you don't have power, you don't have water, then it is a basic necessity. And so that's why we often include that. So there's one more thing that you really need to be sure of when you're looking at a well.
Because we talked about you got to have enough water. You got to be able to get the water out of the ground.
That's right. And then number 3 is it needs to be usable water.
Right. So what we're talking about there is water that's fit to drink, basically.
That's right.
Yeah. And so it's always wise to get water tested by a reputable lab. Sometimes it may be possible to get a free water test from your local county health department, but you can often get a more expensive and extensive test at a private lab. And that can also avoid possible red tape with the health department because, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, as the saying goes. And so when you're getting something for free, they're generally getting something out of it, usually in the form of information about you, stuff like that. So it's up to you. But there are options out there for getting your water tested. Please be sure and do this before you sign on the bottom line. If you're getting a loan on a place, then most likely the lender is going to require this anyway. But this is always a good idea. Depending upon what you're dealing with, you may be able to filter out the bad stuff, but you won't know unless you test the water ahead of time.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
A couple other things. One is the question comes up sometimes about water rights, permits, was the well permitted? A lot of times you can find older wells that were drilled years past where they were not permitted. Is that good? Is that bad? Well, there's pros and cons. Depends on how you look at it. You may not have legal water rights, so to speak, if it's not permitted. Depending upon the state, that's a big topic. I'm not even going to attempt to go there, so I don't even fully understand it myself. But I know here in our state, getting a permit, or I think that's what they call it, a well permit, basically gives you residential water rights up to so many gallons per day, so on and so forth. So if it's not permitted, then technically you may not have those water rights because the state will often claim ownership of all surface water and underground water. Bless their hearts. And but downsides to have a well being permitted is if you get some crazies in your state capital that decide that they want to start doing things like putting meters on wells and charging you per the gallon and things like that, then having a non-permitted well could be a blessing, because they wouldn't even know that you have a well. So, pros and cons both ways. What could be really awesome is if you had an old well that nobody knows about, stick a hand pump on that thing, and then that's your backup well, and then you have your main well, and maybe it's permitted, and that's what you use normally. That could be a nice option. I always like redundancy with water, so, just be aware of that. And let's see, anything else?
Yeah, I've been sitting here trying to make a checklist of all the things that I would want to make sure I checked. So far, you want to, first of all, check the gallons per minute and make sure that you know how much water the well is producing, what size is the casing, What's the static water level? Let's see. Is the water pure? So you want to see a test that's been done, or you want to do a test.
Mm-hmm.
And then if it's permitted or not. Are those the 5 things so far? I think that's everything.
Pretty much.
So
Yep.
yeah, you just have a little checklist before you go, or even when you're looking at your own, go through that checklist and just check.
That's right. Very good. So I hope that's helpful. Water is super, super important, so don't skimp on this one. And usually, where there's a will, there's a way. You can usually work things out. So if you already find yourself in a bad water situation, don't despair. A lot of times, not always, but a lot of times you can work things out. But if you're in the looking stage, persist in looking for a place with a good water setup.
That's right.
And you'll never regret it. Hope that's helpful. Y'all have a great week now, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.